Hi everyone, welcome to this evening's Ulleo Live. Great to have you here. Anyone in the audience, anyone that's joined us, any of our learners, feel free to put in the chat on the right-hand side, just where you're from and where you're joining us from. And yeah, we'll say hello back. And as we go through the sessions, to get the most out of it as we're talking, feel free to put questions in. We'll respond to them as we can, as it comes up. And also, just to let you know what our session is tonight, I'm actually quite excited about it. Something I feel is really important for us as clinicians, just as humans in general, and it's self-care. We're focusing on professional self-care and also looking at clinical supervision. And we've got Dallas Bentley with us here tonight, who has a wealth of knowledge in this area and has done a lot of work also in the men's space as well, which is also really interesting. And we're going to have a chat to him about those things. I'll let him introduce himself first. So, hi, Dallas, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Can you give us a bit of information about yourself and, your work as in the counselling space? Just need to press mute. I think you've been muted. So
Well,
I should
hello,
be doing.
Tracy.
Hey, Dallas.
Oh, you can hear me. Great. Oh, it's great to see you. It's great to meet you in person. And thank you for inviting me along to your Ulleo Live Counselling Toolkit live event. Would that be? I think I got it right. Yes. Look, uh, just for a little bit of context, uh, I I can't see any of the other students. Do we have students? Or I'm just sort of interested in the audience to start with. What sort of people are tuning in this evening? Tracy, I'll just hand it back to you.
On the right hand side, we've got a chat, so we don't actually see people's faces, unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
But we do have people that join in and they give us a hello from where they're from. Sometimes they send in questions, so that's just the chat bar on the right hand side. So there's one person there. There's probably a few more. If anyone just wants to say hello and introduce themselves, that would be great. The other thing is, Dallas, that this recording will be saved, so people can watch it afterwards and they can benefit from your knowledge and information and all the things that you're sharing, and as well as your work as well.
Okay, sure. Well, I think I'll firstly start with introducing myself. My name is Dallas Bentley, and I've been working in the counselling space for just over 20 years. And I've been working in that space predominantly in Australia, but also in parts of Europe, sort of gathering knowledge from the clinicians that I was essentially sort of learning at universities. So I took it quite seriously, and I think that that's something that would be the first point that I would make in relation to the counselling profession, sort of becoming an emergent profession that is necessary to tackle mental health challenges that certainly this country faces currently. And there's been a lot of work done in the space, and I'm sure as students you would be familiar with the governing bodies for counselling specific professional ethics, and that would be where I would point you. If I was to point you in the right direction, firstly, would be to take the code of ethics that you will find in an Australian context, and as a research, a little bit of research, you would compare the code of ethics in counselling in an Australian context with, say, what they're saying in Britain, or what they may be saying in America or Ireland. Okay, so these types of countries that we have certain connections and cultural attitudes and ways of thinking that are quite similar, but you'll see that there's differentiations, and that's certainly a starting point in developing an identity as a professional counsellor.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And Um, I'm just intrigued. This is a bit of a tangent from our questions on self care and supervision. But you mentioned that you engaged with people that you'd sort of seen in your studies, and I noticed on your website that you had a lot of really fascinating people that I think you probably gained from, or that you that are role models. Could you just briefly chat a little bit about those people? Because I thought
Oh
they were
yeah,
really
sure.
fascinating.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
great, Trace. Yeah, sure. Like I'm certainly an advocate for keeping these types of forums quite casual and with fluidity and with humor. So absolutely, I can. So let's have a look. Yeah, I well, I can tell you that my name is Dallas Bentley, and I have a website, and you can go onto that for information about counselling, specific types of questions, or a little bit of sort of awareness, perhaps about my own journey, and things that things that I was able to achieve just in relation to setting a standard for myself. I think that's say if we're talking about counselling as a journey that we go on, and it doesn't really matter when you come to the science and art of counselling, because counselling is both a science and an art, um, uh, as any true science should be. But certainly, in my bio section, I've put in a, a couple of clinicians that sort of informed the style, the framework to counselling that I was taught when I went to university by my teachers, and uh, it's essentially there's essentially a lot of problems with postmodernism and social constructionism now in certain political areas. Okay, so in politics, and what you see happening politically, uh, these types of approaches need to evolve and change. So, what myself and my colleagues, or people you may see on my website that I've worked with or who informed me, um, uh, you'll be able to trace the history. And I think that that's a very important aspect of understanding yourself as a clinician, being able to understand the benefits of clinical supervision, and to be actively seeking it and engaging in clinical supervision as a professional, and with self care, that's something that you actively practice and don't give lip service to. But there's challenges with these in the modern workplace, which we might get to a little bit further down the track. So back
Good
back to you,
answer.
Tracy.
Thanks,
Perhaps
Dallas.
I can.
I've just sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I'll just pop Dallas's website details in the chat if anyone wants to check it out further now or in the future. So that's those role models and clinicians. If you just want to peer into there and have a little peek and see what those influences are, as well as the extra info on clinical supervision. Sorry, what were you going to say, Dallas?
Oh no, I was just going to perhaps just ask you a little bit about your counselling journey, Tracy, because we're meeting for the first
Okay.
time.
Thank you. So this is a chat from a while back. We did this in the first session ages ago, but yeah, it's
Okay,
always good
okay.
to refresh and also
Yes,
for you to have a
please.
bit of an idea. So I've had an interesting career path. I was a teacher in the past. I've done a bit of teaching in Australia and overseas. I kind of was like, oh, I need a bit of a break from that. I worked in construction, which is an interesting
Hmm.
trajectory in the Northwest. I live in
Fantastic.
Karratha at the moment.
Okay.
And then I was overseas teaching later, and then I just was like, I've always been interested in the pastoral care side, probably more so than some of the content, even though I enjoyed what I was teaching. I was an English teacher, and yeah, I like literature, it's beautiful. Uh, when I first left school, though, I wanted to get into psychology. I did delved into that a little bit, wasn't the right time. And so, as a mature age person, I've gone back and I studied counselling. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go, if it was social work, psych, counselling, and counselling seemed like a good fit to me. And
Mm.
so I did a grad dip. and then I did a Masters of Counselling, and I finished that. And so I've worked in like relationship space, generalized counselling. I've also worked with FIFO people, people in mining. So
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in that area myself. I kind of have a bit of an
Yeah.
understanding of that.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a real interest in like trauma and attachment. I'd like to do more work in the somatic area. I feel like that's a really can be really beneficial. And currently, I work in the family domestic violence space. So I've worked with victim survivors, and now currently I work with mandated offenders.
And how's that working out for you, Tracy?
I actually love it. I've actually just had my clinical supervision session with a new clinical
Fantastic.
supervisor just before this. So she's a
Fantastic.
lovely First Nations lady
Mm,
who's
mm,
also got an
mm.
awareness of FTV. So for
Yes.
me, it's really honed my skill set.
Mm,
Sometimes it's
mm.
tricky,
Yes.
but I find to come to what I need to do. So it's a different type of counselling, and it's also a lot of group work. And group
Mm,
work can be really powerful. So it's like kind of balancing this accountability and ownership with compassion. So I feel like with whoever we work with, we need to come with an open heart and with compassion and empathy and non-judgment. So that's where I'm at anyway at the moment. We'll
yeah.
see. Watch this page; it'll continue, no doubt.
I'll be watching it closely. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that there's some real benefits just for the students, or perhaps the other students that may watch this podcast at a future point. That there was a really interesting thing that Tracy sort of said there in her career development, and that was that she was able to, which I really encourage you to do, which is something that I've been able to do also, is that even if you have experience in another area, yeah, you can use your counselling skills, yes, and sort of put them together for the benefit of the community or an individual that you're working with, and you can benefit yourself and the people that are around you because you're utilizing these skills. And then on top of that is also, when Tracy was saying that, with the FIFO workers, that's there's those elements, and then there's also the potentiality for networking and networking those things so that you're also taking charge of your own career development. I think this is really, really important because it can be quite confusing and certainly I can very much relate to what Tracy was saying in relation to, she wasn't quite sure about social work, counseling, psychology. Where are the differentiations? It could be something that can be quite baffling, both for a mature age student entering the profession of sort of mental health as a whole, and also for younger people that may have finished high school, maybe had a year or two off, and then they're sort of dipping their toe in the water with counselling. Um, but certainly having, being able to utilize all of the skills that you have from your day-to-day life, from things that you've experienced, all goes into sort of building from the bottom up, um, uh, you know, the type of counselor or professional that you'd like to be, and having your own autonomy in making clear decisions in relation to your career development or your career progression. And that's a bit of a specialization of mine that you can see on my website, in relation to career development and being able to map a career for yourself so that any ambiguity about choices or choice points can be lowered so that you can be clear in your thinking, and be taking a thing I call true action. Yeah. So just a little, just a
Thanks
couple
heaps
little
for that,
just a
Dallas. I
couple little
think
hints.
there's a wealth of information. I recommend if anyone's interested that this is going to be up on your portal, so you'll be able to watch it again if you want to just flick through this and get some more information and refresh. Um, just hearing you talk about that true action. For me, my path is like I'm followed by what I'm interested in, what's available. But I've also been really lucky to have, I think, some role models or leaders or people that are mentors. So I've been able
Yes.
to bounce some of that journey off them, and that I find is really valuable. Like, you might know it might feel true, but you just need that extra bit of
Mm.
information, or there might be this thing that you've never seen before that you could get directed down. So even with the Ulleo, our sort of emerging learners here, we you do have a session at the end with me as well, if you want, and you can always flick a question through to the learning team, and I can answer it. But yeah, what Dallas was saying too, that there's the availability of reaching out to people like Dallas or others and just going, what is this journey I'm on, and where would I like to go? How can I get there? What do you know? And where can you point me that can be really beneficial? And it is also part of our clinical supervision, because we need that professional. We need to feel good in what we do. Um, but yeah, thank you for passing all that on, Dallas.
It's my
So
pleasure.
I'm just wondering, sorry?
It's my pleasure.
We've talked about clinical supervision and that professional journey and the professional
Mm.
identity.
Mm.
Before we go into that any further, I'm wondering if we can segue back to the beginning where you talked about self care, and you
Mm-hmm.
said not to just give it lip service, that
Yes.
it needs to be, I guess, genuine. Can you talk a
Mm.
little bit more about what that self care is, what it looks like, how we can practice it?
Mm. Look, it's a challenging question because I've certainly noticed within a modern Australian workplace in the helping professions, the notion of self care is something that you uh, perhaps your manager will provide a three-page PowerPoint slide on how to practice, and that's the sum total of what you get when you start in a workplace. So it's really up to you as the professional or as the student, the emergent professional, if you're still working on your qualification. The best thing that you can do with self care, where you start, is the breath. Okay, that's the most important natural unconscious regulator of the human body. Okay, so you start with monitoring and understanding your breath and how it works. Certainly, from just speaking from my own, what I do for myself, which might be useful, is once once I've become aware of my breath and how it's used, and certainly the breath is used in all manner of things, especially in counselling because you do speak. It's better to be an active listener, of course, but you do speak. Okay, so and you can use certain tones or tonalities in your speaking voice, okay, to elicit a change in someone. It can be really quite as practical and profound as that when you're engaging in a therapeutic process with someone. Okay, so with self care, it's the breath. Okay, so really just honestly being disciplined and practicing yourself. So you can start. You can take one hand and put it above your right breast, and you put the other hand right in the middle of your tummy. Okay, and you can get a good sense there with the diaphragm. And this is certainly something that I've used as self care, but I was taught this as a singer. I was a professional singer before I entered the professional realms of counselling and academia. So I was a trained singer. So certainly, if you think about a singer or a performer or an artist, they need to be calm. They need to use their breath. They need to be able to de-stress before they perform. And if you think about counseling, it's not a performance, but you need to be very self-aware. Yes, and being self-aware is a part of what makes someone a good um, actor or a singer or a dramatist or even a good writer. You need to be very self-aware. So the self-awareness starts with the breath. Okay, so that's the very first thing, and then just practically just a daily routine. Yeah, and then also finding things that work for you. Yeah, certainly, I advocate for clinical supervision uh, practice is essential for self-care. Okay. So that's one thing. There's the breath, and then there's the regulation of your own emotions, your own body, your own rhythms, having enough sleep, getting the exercise that you need. Yes. And then another form of self-care would be to, you may have heard the old saying, practice what you preach. So one thing that I say to my students when I'm teaching is that when you're involved in counseling, or if you get a job in the counseling world, or if you're working as a therapist and someone's paying you to do it, then and you're being ethical with your clients, yes. But some so-called professionals, when they're outside of the therapy room, they're acting unethically, and it can be difficult because ethics, clinical supervision, self-care, they all merge as one. But for one reason or another, with the way that uh, business attitudes change because of changes in government or legislation, or different things that are happening, on national and federal governmental levels, affects all of these things in the workplace. Okay, that you need to be you need to be quite aware. Okay, but just to keep it simple, self-care starts with the breath. Okay, and self-awareness, and then just getting regular exercise and sleep. So that's that's where we would start. That would be a start. And just to finish off the thing with the lip service is that you need to be really you need to be, as a professional counselor, you need to be disciplined with your own self-care, because no one else is going to sort of the expectation in the modern workplace is that you're the professional, you know how to look after yourself. Yes.
Yeah.
Where 10 or 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't so much the case. So you need to be very aware of that in the modern workplace, so that self-care, yeah, is really a way for you to build up also a suit of armor or protection around yourself, with clients and colleagues and managers and bosses and people within multidisciplinary teams who will push forward professional agendas that don't work cohesively for the benefit of their clients a lot of the time. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's we do a 3-hour lecture on that one, Tracy, couldn't we?
We
But
could.
these are just really practical things, Like
I
I want
love
to
that
be. I
you
think.
started with the breath.
Mm,
And the thing is, all those other things are relevant and so important and really
yes,
impact, because we are
it's all
responsible for
self-care.
ourselves. We need to take
Mm,
autonomy. We need to take ownership, because no one else will. And some of our
yes,
workplaces are wonderful, and some of them are not so
yes,
wonderful. So we need
right.
to ensure that we're okay.
Mm,
Um,
absolutely, we
and
do.
I love that you started with the breath. And what I
Mm,
noticed as you were talking, I was like, oh, I've actually had a bit of rushing around today. I've had a lot on my
mm,
plate.
yeah.
And you were just modulating your voice. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm coming back home. I'm coming back to presence. It was so good. And it's like what you were talking, you were really modeling that. And that's what we can do with our clients. And like those mirror neurons and that attunement, we're actually helping people regulate and bringing them back. And that's really powerful. I think if that's the only thing you do in a session and you listen to someone, that's a value.
Mm,
Yeah. But like you're saying, we need to have those practices in place, the breath and the sleep and the eating and the other things as well, so that we can access that space. Um, so thank you for sharing that breath. And you were also talking about, I guess it sounded like you were talking about boundaries, because what you were
yes.
saying was that there's people, managers, maybe other organizations, other entities we engage with that might not have, they might have other agendas or other priorities, and that might not mesh well with what's required for clients.
Mm,
Um, And sometimes, I don't know, for me, I found that those situations really bring up a lot of turmoil. Like, I'm like,
Mm,
I'm supposed to be doing this with the client, but then I'm supposed to, they're still wanting this, and it doesn't feel right. Something inside feels wrong for me.
mm,
And that's a hard thing to navigate because you're employed by someone, you've got other needs to meet, but you've also got your ethical requirements for your client. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's a tricky space to find yourself in. And how would we
mm.
navigate that?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a tricky space, and there, with a number of those things, there can be no hard and fast rules. It really comes down to professional competence. Yes, and that having experience with navigating those types of ethical dilemmas can be quite tricky. And this is where clinical supervision really comes in handy, um, because you may be faced with a ethical decision in the workplace. You will be faced with ethical decisions on a daily basis. Full stop. I just had an old lecture come back to me that I did on ethics probably about a year ago. But I remember telling the students that because there's always a lot of talk about ethics, or people will again use that word to perhaps act in a superior way to you, especially if you're a young emerging student and you're not really sure what ethics is, or if you're not really sure what standards are, or you're not really sure what boundaries are. Okay. Um, but this is where clinical supervision comes in, because this is something that you need to discuss uh, with a clinical supervisor, someone who you feel that you can build a professional, trusting relationship. Okay. So it's kind of like a patient doctor sort of privilege process, and it's very um, important to engage in clinical supervision, because you can speak about these ethical concerns that you're having that come from you, come from your professional competence, come from your learning, and also just come from your gut. Just as a human being, just as someone that has as much right to life as anyone else. These types of things. So, you know, these are the things that you can point out, and certainly on my website, I think it's in the blog section, I have a number of short articles on ethics that you can go to. Um, there is a quote from Mr. David Axton, who was one of my teachers. Back in the day, and he was one of the founding members of PACFA, um, and he's a he would be one of the teachers or specialists in the counselling space in relation to these um, sort of situations that Tracy and I are talking about, that you'll find um, happen in the workplace, where you need to make clear decisions about what you're going to do, um, so that you're all right, firstly, and your client's welfare is protected as much as you can, with the uh, with what's happening within the process within the workplace. Okay, but certainly having clinical supervision, or having someone there on a regular basis, if it's once a month, something like this. And I'm really only able to share these things with you is because this is what I learned, and this is what I sort of practice in my career in working as a counsellor. Um, I guess the brainwashing works. There's a bit of humour there. Okay, the humour is very important too. And certainly, if you're looking for a supervisor, someone that you can work on the hard questions with, so that you can grow. But find someone that you get on with as a person. Find someone that's real. Find someone that you can relate to. Find someone that doesn't see you as inferior. This is very important too in clinical supervision. If you're practicing clinical supervision correctly in a collaborative way, uh, there's always going to be a power differentiation, yeah, between us, but it's your job as a counselor to manage that power differentiation and bring your own skills Because if clinical supervision is being done correctly in a collaborative way, then both the supervisor and the supervisee are learning at the same time. Okay? It's not one, right? It's not one dominant person or personality. So these are things you need to look out for when you're, when you're doing your research to find a clinical supervisor. That the supervisor isn't sitting up here and you're down here. Right? A good clinical supervisor meets you here, yes, and you're both learning as you work together. Okay, so that and so that would be a recommendation in relation to seeking a clinical supervisor you feel comfortable with, that's real, that can use humor, that isn't talking all this jargon sort of stuff to you all the time. Like there's certain language and terminology that relates to certain frameworks in counselling and psychotherapy and psychology. Yeah. And what I'd always advocate, it's becoming increasingly difficult, but if you can find a supervisor that has a similar framework that you feel comfortable in using as a counsellor, that's also a benefit because you're already on the same page when you're working together. Like if if you say you've got a clinical supervisor that's that's a hard line psychiatrist using diagnostic analysis as their interpretation of people's emotional states and the human condition in general, and you're into you're a solution focused therapist person, you could maybe meet them halfway, but you would find that the language is too different. So when you would speak to the supervisor, where you relate or you'd be speaking about ethical concerns that you may have in a workplace, you'll find that there won't be a flow. That there might be a rigidity to it. Yes, so you need to sort of do your research when and if you can, find a clinical supervisor that that has a fairly good understanding of maybe 3 or 4 different approaches to counselling, and that has specialises in at least one or two, where they can take you through that, or someone that has the the sort of all-round experience, not just textbook, but a bit of textbook, bit of academia, and real life experience. So so that's very important. That's why I recommend my website. Yeah, so yeah, a little bit of humour there. But thank you, Tracy. I appreciate the promotion earlier on in the
Yeah,
podcast.
no
So
worries.
yeah,
I think there
great.
is actually seriously quite a lot of information there, and the blog, if
Yeah,
anyone's looking, there's a button down the bottom on the right-hand side. We're
thanks,
not
Tracy.
here about promotion, but it's helpful to
Yes.
get extra information. And just
Mm,
listening to you there, Dallas, there's a few things you're bringing up there. So what I saw or what I heard was that there was this great picture that you showed of what that supervision, clinical supervision space would be like, what that would feel like
mm,
for someone
mm,
potentially. And
mm,
you mentioned this equality. I kind of think that if it's a really good relationship and really good supervision, it also models how we can work with clients as well. Like
mm,
we're not going to be doing this either. If we've got a supervisor that works with us like that, we're more likely to model that a collaborative approach, which I think can be really beneficial.
yes.
The other thing as well that you mentioned was looking at a framework. So um, the learning portal, so everyone's at different levels and has different backgrounds, but our learning portal has a really great range of information about origins of psychology, emotions, thoughts, relationships, attachment. There's a whole lot of things, but we're not really focusing on particular frameworks. So that's something that some of the links have, but I'd encourage learners to investigate that more. So Dallas touched on a few different ways that people might. I guess it's really how we look at what does it mean to be human, what drives our behaviour, and how do we work with this. Those are frameworks that we can use in our practice. And people often will have more than one, which is helpful. And I like Dallas said that someone that's got a really solid grasp of around 3. So that's something for learners to maybe investigate further. And just that we want to have that gel with that clinical supervisor. Would that be right? Did I hear you right there, Dallas, with what I've just said?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, all those points are so important. And I really like that you painted that picture of what that would look like. And we don't always find the right person first up either. I've had some mostly great experiences and some not so great. So it's like sometimes you might go into the water and it doesn't feel right. So you find a different pool to swim in. And the other thing, as you were talking, as I was thinking of the things that come up for us as clinicians, so we have the things in the workplace, what comes up with clients. We bring that to supervision, what methods we're using. So how do we use this artistry? What's the science? What's backing this up? Sometimes things come up for us personally. So for me, I always promote as well that we have our own therapist, that we go see someone if we need to, if things come up for us. And it's a good resource to have in the background if you need it, if anything becomes tricky, because we deal with some difficult situations. Is that something that you promote at all, Dallas? And what would that look like for people as clinicians? Because sometimes it feels uncomfortable to say, "Oh, I'm also going to see someone." I think for me, it means that we know what it feels like to be a client. We know what it feels like to have that power imbalance. But could you talk a little bit more to that as part of self care?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was just going to say that is a part of self care,
Yeah.
certainly. And again, when you're getting therapy from another counsellor, then you need to ensure that there's very clear boundaries with that person, and that is kept in a professional context also, because you can see younger emergent counsellors again have difficulty with boundaries, difficulty with understanding what these professional relationships are. But certainly, if you're seeing someone for clinical supervision, yes, and if you're seeing someone as a therapist, that the most important thing is boundaries and understanding that this is a professional relationship, and there is an agreed payment, okay, for those things. And certainly, um, it can get a little bit tricky, because as learners we learn to be supervisors, and certainly I advocate, from my teaching methodology, that student counsellors, that the teacher's responsibility is to assist student counsellors to become leaders and supervisors. But again, it's really about remaining professional, getting the help that you need, because it's a part of self-care, and not feeling that there's something wrong with you, because you're supposed to be the counsellor, and the clients are the ones that have got the problems. But again, as Tracy was saying, it's really about self-care, and if you have the right team of people around you, you'll find you'll have a very, very long and successful career in counselling, human services, psychology, and social work, whatever you're going for. And that's what we want to see. That's certainly what I want to see. Both young people that are entering the profession, both men and women, and more mature age people coming into the profession also, as they bring their life experiences, and that can be a different journey for students who come into counselling in middle age. But yeah, so it's quite an exciting space to be in, and I think that with the governing bodies that we have with ACA, and I think that's one of the questions there, Tracy, that we may or may not be able to get to this evening. Go onto the website. There's clinical supervisors there. There's counsellors there, and just test a few out. Yeah, but the main point I'll finish on is that your friends aren't your counsellors. Mum and dad aren't counsellors. Your sister, or don't try to be a counsellor to your sister, because I tried that. I tried that in my family, and it just didn't work.
Yeah,
So don't ever believe
agreed.
if you're studying to be a counsellor, you don't try and counsel your family members. That's rule number one. Okay.
I think we can use those micro skills though, like they can be lovely as far as
I'm sure
our
you do,
listening, as
Tracy.
long as we don't become like a rodent or a carrot.
Yeah. So
Maybe
these are all
not.
the advantages of being a counsellor, you see. So,
Yeah.
so you've chosen the right profession, students. All the benefits. Yeah, it's very so again, it's a bit of humour. You see how I was quite serious then, and then a bit of humour. So it's important to have that balance. It's important to have that balance. There's another strategy for self care. Yes, because you need to be able to laugh at yourself and not take things seriously. You need to take things seriously when they matter, but you need to use humor, which is a very subtle skill in therapy. Um, that takes time to develop. Okay, because there's certainly um, situations where humor wouldn't be appropriate. Yes. And you also need to be very cognizant and very aware of different other people's senses of humor in workplaces because um, they can be a challenge to you. Again, because of an Australian context, in Australian culture, in Australian context, it's a difficult landscape to navigate because one person's sense of humour is different from another, and yeah, so humour is very important for self care. But when you're doing therapy with someone, then humour is something that develops within the structure of building the rapport and the trust with the client, and ensuring that you are working with them in a very genuine, very compassionate, and very ethical way. And if you're doing that, if you're using the skills that you've learned, if you're practicing ethical types of counselling in the workplace and outside in your daily life, then you're going to have more success as a therapist. You're going to have more clients, and you're going to be able to build more trust not only within your professional identity as a counselor, but within your life, within your friendship circle, within your family circle. Yeah. So there's a lot of benefits.
I'm hearing from you there's like this congruency where we're like walking our talk, you're saying before.
Mm, mm,
And uh, also, I guess, just holding this space of genuineness. I think a lot of the people we work with, people have had some hard times, and
mm.
often they can be quite astute as to whether they the BS monitor, like people can sense it.
Yeah,
So it's really
I think so.
important to turn up as ourselves professionally. Um, and you're talking about that as part of our professional practice, also part of that self care as well. Um, can you talk a little bit more about the clinical supervision process and how that runs? We talked about the space. Like, can you tell us a little bit more about what that involves, what people might expect? You've covered this a bit already.
Yes. So yes, certainly. So with clinical supervision, it's a process of the clinical supervisor getting to know the supervisee, getting to know their experience, getting to know perhaps some of the things that they're interested in. There's a process. It's clinical supervision. It has some similarities and some differences from a normal therapy session. Okay. The differentiation is that when you're engaging with a clinical supervisor, then prior to any type of agreement going into place or any kind of sort of exchange of ideas or exchange of commerce, then you need to fill out. You need to give the clinical supervisor a fairly good understanding about where you want to take your journey. Okay, is it going to be once a month? Is it going to be once a week? Is it going to be 6 sessions specifically? So the responsibility is really on the supervisee to provide the clinical supervisor with the information that the clinical supervisor will first provide. Yes. And then that gives the clinical supervisor a very clear indication of different goals. Um, I don't know if you've heard of goals theory in psychology. So you're looking at you see different goals, different benchmarks, things that need to be addressed and looked at. in a very thorough way, in a very delineated time frame. That's the best way to get value for your money when you're getting clinical supervision of someone, because you've already taken the responsibility yourself to map out what it is that you need, and then you work with a clinical supervisor to gain the self-awareness and the emergent knowledge that you need in order to maintain a long history in the business of being a professional counselor. Okay, because a lot of people will burn out, and they'll burn out because they're not actively taking accountability for the process of clinical supervision, which is very empowering. There's kind of this myth, and it's been around for a long time, that clinical supervision is something that it's mandated, or it's something that you need to be fearful of, or it's something that's where you're going to feel inferior. But again, as I was saying, the proper way to do clinical supervision is in a collaborative way and a structured way. Yeah, and when you talk to a clinical supervisor, you want to go to their website. You want to see, what do I get? How is this going to work? And then you do your finances. Okay, I've got this amount of money for clinical supervision, and then I'm doing this job, and then I've got this job coming up. So you need to sort of map it out financially as well. But that's the best way to approach clinical supervision, that you take accountability for what you want. And then once you do that, the clinical supervisor guides you into increased self-awareness and the attainment of new knowledge systems that you need in order to develop your skills. So that's essentially the process.
Awesome. Thanks so much for mapping that out, Dallas. That's really
That's right.
helpful. And it is, for me, there's just, I hear transparency and clarity sort of coming through there, that there's this transparent process, there's some clarity, there's direction from the supervisee taking ownership of this process, giving guidance to the clinical supervisor as to what they are interested in, and the clinical supervisor helps work collaboratively to bring about those outcomes. Is that about right? Sort of what you're saying
absolutely.
there?
Yes, it absolutely is. So it's mapping it out together. There's a collaborative component, and to just sort of sum up clinical supervision, it's like you're making a sculpt. That you're both sculptors, okay, and that you're both creating something from a piece of rock or a piece of marble. You're creating it together. Yes, and what will be the end point of that, you don't know, because there is no end point. You see, you're continually creating together. So that's a nice metaphor that I just thought of then.
Thinking there's some really lovely. I love art, so there's some really beautiful
Yeah,
artistry metaphors and analogies
yeah,
you're making, even as you were
yeah.
talking in the beginning about the process of counselling, that there's the science and there's the
Yes,
artistry. 'Cause there's all these tools
very
that, and
much.
even like humour that you mentioned, like we
Mm,
might be uncomfortable at first, but when we become comfortable with an artistry, or like if you like sport, it can be those different sporting techniques that you use. We bring them into that practice so that we can have a fluidity in that approach. And it sounds like to me that that's something similar in the supervision process as well, that we're coming together to create something, and we're using all these tools to create
mm.
something of, hopefully, of beauty. Um,
Yes,
you must have a lot of wonderful experiences. Like, I think it's so inspiring when you see people shine and they're on their journey, and they hit some of those points, or they have an insight and an epiphany. You must have some really lovely experiences, Dallas, with the people you work with.
I have. Yes, I've had a. Yeah, it's certainly been a very worthwhile career. I certainly just sort of fell into it, like a lot of people do when they fall. You hear this phrase, just fell into it. um, but yeah, there's certainly I've certainly been able to create an environment in which my clients and the students that I teach can feel empowered to make decisions that are life affirming for themselves, or to take not to take risks, but to stand up for themselves. And certainly, the joy, or what makes my heart sing, is the ability to guide or to facilitate a process in which an individual or a group can have the courage to do something that perhaps prior to engagement didn't have the confidence to do. So,
Cool. Might sound a bit cliched or trite, but that courage to shine.
yes, and absolutely the courage to shine, and that's certainly not a cliche at all. Certainly, the courage to be able to stand up, um, and you know, it's difficult because when you do ask me that question, Tracy, that I really feel is coming from your heart, it really it did make me think of maybe 3 or 4 individuals that I've seen. Their lives have turned around, and I don't like to claim ownership of that. Yeah, I think that's very important too, as a counsellor, to always uh, retain humility in the services that you offer, or the skills that you offer in a therapeutic process with someone. Um, but yeah, thanks for the question, Tracy.
Welcome.
So, did you have any last questions for me, Tracy?
Well, we've actually got 5 minutes left for the session,
Okay,
and I was just wondering if any of our
that's good
people on
timing.
the online have any questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. This has been a wealth of knowledge and incredibly enjoyable and interesting session. If no one's got any questions, I can definitely add a few more in. Um, we mentioned in the beginning, I think this is something that a lot of the learners actually, or people taking part in the course, are
Mm,
interested in and wanting to know more, because a lot of people are early or emerging in their journey.
yes.
Um, how do they make a choice? Like, how do they know where to next? I know this is a big question for the last 5 minutes. Sorry to do that to you. You mentioned a bit about looking at those choices, seeing what fits right, but can you give any other advice?
Mm,
There's the professional bodies, but what else is there that people can use to kind of guide those decisions as to whether it's support work or community work, youth
mm,
work,
mm, mm,
whether it's
mm,
more of an
mm,
academic take, social work, psych? What would how would people know what to do, which way to go?
mm. I think, practically speaking, uh, listen to what your own heart is telling you first. Um, Write a journal of what you're experiencing um, in a workplace or on a placement. Take very close, make very close attention uh, to the types of clients that you may work with, um, the types of workplaces. So journaling is certainly one thing that I would suggest. Certainly through the process of journaling, it can help you, or it can assist you to make both personal and career decisions with more clarity. Yes. So journaling, um, having a go at a few things. Certainly, don't stick to one thing, but have uh, have enough sort of common sense to understand that you need to find one type of area that you're interested in pursuing more than another. Because if you jump around, you know, in a few different areas, if we're just talking about the workplace, because I don't think we'll have enough time to cover uh, psych social work and other allied health professionals this evening. But certainly in the workplace, working in a few different workplaces, working with a wide variety of different clients, and then getting a bit of a feel about, where do you fit? So where do you want to fit? Um, what is it that makes your heart sing? What is it that you think you can do? Um, perhaps a little bit more long term. Um, Certainly, if you have a pretty good idea about what you want to do in a career by the time you're 30, yes, that's normally research indicates that that's normally a fairly good sort of benchmark if you're a younger learner, that by around the age of 30, you should have a pretty good idea about what it is that you do well and what it is you're interested in pursuing. Yeah? And then, you will find through the process of journaling, through the process of working in different work environments and different roles, whether it's human services or youth work or these types of things, what's going to be a better fit for you. And then from there, you map out what are the qualifications you need to attain in order to push your career journey down the road in a positive way.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dallas. I think that's probably a really lovely note to finish on, and some guidance. And it sounds like really listening to that inner voice and reflecting, and seeking guidance when needed.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for asking me along this evening, Tracy.
Wonderful. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, everyone, you can view this again if you'd like. Check out Dallas's website. And yeah, thank you for the lovely comments and the thanks that's just popping up. And yeah, hopefully we might get you back another time if you're interested, Dallas. It would be lovely.
Fantastic. Thanks, and all the best of luck to everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dallas. Bye-bye.